Okay, so let's review what we've learned so far for Unit 8. Okay, so we've been talking about the different trig ratios in this unit. So remember, the way we can remember that is SOHCAHTOA. Okay, so I told you another way to remember it is some old hippie caught a hippie tripping on acid. Okay, so what that tells us is that sine of theta equals opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine equals adjacent over hypotenuse. Okay, and the last part, the TOA, that gives us the last ratio, which is tangent equals opposite over adjacent. Okay, so there's our three ratios. All right, so the very first thing we did on that first day of class, we looked at how to just set up the ratios. Okay, so let's say we have triangle ABC. It's a right triangle. And the side lengths are, let's say, 10, 12, and 16. Okay, that one's going to be the longest one. It's the biggest number because that one's the hypotenuse. Okay. All right, so let's say we're going to write out the sine of the ratio sine B, cosine B, and tangent B. Okay, well first, to do that, first thing we have to do is label our triangle. Okay, so like I always say in class, always start by labeling the hypotenuse. It's the one across from the right angle, and it's always going to be the longest one. Okay, so I'm going to go and call this one hypotenuse. All right, so we're writing everything in respect to B. Okay, so that's what we're going to use to label our opposite and adjacent. Remember, opposite just means across from. So if you go from theta, you go across the triangle, 12 is going to be opposite. Okay, and the 10, that would be adjacent. Okay, remember adjacent just means next to, so this is the side next to B, so that one's adjacent. Okay, so now we have our opposite, hypotenuse, and adjacent. All right, so to write our ratios, we're just going to plug everything in. Okay, so we have the ratios written out up here. Okay, so sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Okay, so to write the ratios, I'm just going to find what I labeled as opposite and what I labeled as hypotenuse. Okay, so sine B is just going to be 12 over 16. All right, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So find what you labeled as adjacent and what you labeled as hypotenuse. So cosine is going to be 10 over 16. Sorry, looks bad. There you go. And of course, the last one, tangent, is opposite over adjacent. So again, come over here, look what you labeled as opposite, and look at what you labeled as adjacent. Okay, so it's opposite over adjacent, so tangent of B is going to be 12 over 10. All right, so that was the very first thing we learned, was just setting up the ratios. All right, the next thing we talked about is solving for sides. So I'm going to move the paper over here. We're going to look at solving for sides. Okay, so let's say I have a triangle. Okay, so again, another right triangle. We'll call this one DEF, triangle DEF. Let's say we know this angle is, let's go with 80 degrees. Again, it's not drawn to scale, but we'll call that one 80 degrees. Let's call this one what we're solving for in, and let's say this side is 50. Okay, so all of this will be on your problem. All right, so our objective here is we're going to solve for in. Okay, that's the side that we're solving for. All right, so just like we talked about in class, when we're solving for sides, there's going to be a couple steps that we're always going to take. The first thing is just label it. Okay, so always label whatever the angle is as theta. Okay, remember the angle is always theta. Okay, and then just like what we did earlier, we're going to label opposite, hypotenuse, and adjacent. Okay, so the one across from the right angle, again, that's always the hypotenuse. The one across from theta is always opposite, which leaves this one to be adjacent. Okay, so look at what you're solving for, which here we're solving for n, and then look at what you have a number for. So we have the 50 for adjacent. Go and circle this one too. All right, so that was the very first step, is we labeled everything. The second step is we're going to figure out which ratio to use to solve for n. Okay, so again, going back to what we talked about earlier, SOHCAHTOA, okay, that's our three ratios. Well, if you look at our problem, the one we're solving for is the hypotenuse, and the one we have a number for is adjacent. So which one uses adjacent and hypotenuse? Well, that's going to be cosine. Okay, so I know for this problem, I'm going to be using the cosine function. All right. Okay, so that was step 2. Step 3 is we're going to plug in. Okay, so plug everything in as you see it. So cosine, so theta, I'm going to plug in 80. For adjacent, I'm going to plug in 50. And for hypotenuse, I'm going to plug in the variable I'm solving for. Alright, so all I've done so far is label, choose the ratio, and plug in. And then our final step with these problems is we're going to cross multiply and solve. Okay. Alright, so remember, to cross multiply, we have to have a fraction on both sides. So put a 1 under this, and then we're going to multiply that way and that way. So 1 times 50 is just 50. And then whatever is down here on the bottom, I want you to put that in front of the sine, cosine, or tangent. So whether that's a number or a letter, always put that out in front. So n cosine 80. Alright, so we're solving for n here. Okay, so this is being multiplied, so the inverse multiplication is division. So to get n by itself, we're going to divide both sides by cosine 80. Alright, so on this right side, we're left with n. And on this left side, we're left with something that we can just plug into the calculator. 50 divided by cosine 80. Okay, so I'm going to show y'all on online how to access a graphing calculator, since y'all probably don't have one at home. So on your assignment today, I'm going to post a link on it, but it's pretty easy. The site you need to go to is called desmos.com/calculator. Alright, so if you go to your laptop, alright, so again, I'm just going to type in desmos.com/calculator, and I've been using it a lot, so I'm going to go and click on it. Okay, the very first thing you need to do when you get onto the Desmos calculator is you're going to have to change the mode. Okay, so calculators can have degree mode or radian mode. Now, we don't really need to worry about that too much in this class. We're only going to deal with degree mode. So to do that, go over here to the right side, click on this wrench right here. You're going to go down. If you see it has the word radians highlighted, we want the word degrees highlighted instead. Okay, if you don't do that, all your answers are going to be incorrect. So make sure you do that first thing. Okay, so I'm just going to click this to get out of that. Alright, and then here's where you're going to type your answer. Alright, so if you look down here in the bottom left corner, there's a little keypad that shows up. So just click on that. Alright, so here it has your numbers and different functions. If you actually click on the function button, that's where you can see the sine, cosine, and tangent, and then the ones we're going to use later, inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. Alright, so let's go ahead and type in what we've got in our problem to figure out the answer. Okay, so what we were left with was 50 divided by cosine 80. So just like we did in class, okay, just type in exactly how you see it. So it's going to be 5, 0, make sure I can see both, divided by, okay. All right, and then again, to get to the cosine, sine, and tangent buttons, just click functions. So hit cosine. Okay, then again, it was 50 divided by cosine 80. All right, and this is the answer. Okay, remember, so we're always gonna round to 2. So we're gonna say 287.94 for our answer. So therefore, n equals 287.94. All right, again, since there's not any units in our problem, there doesn't need to be any units in the answer. So that's our final answer. All right, so the last thing that we did in class was solving for angles. I got a little space down here. All right, maybe I'll just go through two different things. Okay, so solving for angles. All right, so let's say I have 2 sides and I need to solve for an angle. All right, so again, here's my right triangle. Let's call this one triangle GHI. All right, and then this is 20, and this is 12. All right, so say the problem says solve for the measure of angle I. All right, so here's our problem. We're gonna solve for angle I. Okay, so just like solving for sides, we also follow some steps for this. Okay, so just like last time, the first thing we're gonna wanna do is label. All right, so remember, the first thing you wanna label is theta. Theta is always gonna be whatever angle you're solving for, or whatever angle is given in the problem. And for this one, since we're solving for I, we're gonna label that one theta. All right, the 20 is the side that's across from the right triangle, or the right angle, so we're going to call that one the hypotenuse. And the 12 is across from theta, so we're going to label that one as opposite. Okay, so again, go ahead and circle that so you know exactly what you're working with. All right, so after we label, the second thing we're going to do is, just like the last example, we're going to determine which trig ratio we're going to use. All right, we've got opposite and hypotenuse here. So I know that the one that uses opposite and hypotenuse is going to be sine. All right, so again, just like when you're solving for sides, the first 2 steps are to just label it and then figure out which trig ratio you're going to use for this problem. All right, and then the third step, again, still the same thing, is we're just going to plug in. All right, so again, for theta, that's the one that we're solving for, which is I, so I'm going to say sine I equals, okay, for opposite, we labeled that one, we labeled 12, and hypotenuse is 20. All right, so there's steps 1 through 3. All right, and then the last one, we're going to use what we call inverse functions. Step 4, use the inverse trig functions. Okay, so in order to solve for this I, okay, we have to do the inverse of sine. Okay, so all the functions have inverse functions. So for sine, the inverse, we have inverse sine. For cosine, we have inverse cosine, and for tangent, we have inverse tangent. All right, so in order to get the I by itself here, remember that's what we're solving for. To get rid of the sine part, we have to do the inverse of that side. All right, so make sure you write it out properly. So we're taking the inverse sine of sine I. All right, well, y'all learned in algebra that what you do to one side, you also have to do to the other side. So if we take the inverse sine of that side, we also have to take the inverse sine of this side. All right, so on the left side, this cancels out, so I'm just left with I. On the right side, again, this is just something that we can type into the calculator. Okay, so again, we're going to type it in exactly how we see it. Again, we're going to use the Desmos calculator. All right, so Go to functions. So as you can see, right next to the sine, cosine, and tangent buttons are the inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent buttons. So for this one, we're going to use inverse sine. All right, so our problem, it was the inverse sine of 12 divided by 20. All right, so this is our answer there, so 36.87. Remember, we're solving for an angle for this one. Okay, so angles we measure in degrees, so our answer is 36.87 degrees. All right, oops, sorry. All right, there you go. So you can do the inverse of any of them. So if this was, let's say this was cosine I equals 12 over 20, then instead we would just do the inverse cosine. If this was tangent I equals 12 over 20, then we would just do inverse tangent of 12 over 20. Okay, so again, the biggest thing, biggest mistake I've seen today is make sure you put your calculator in degree mode. Because if you don't, your answers will look different. Okay, so make sure you put it in degree mode. All right, so go ahead and try to practice. If you are still struggling, try to pause it and try to follow along with the video. If y'all need help, just make sure you message me.